And now it is next time. So, where we left off, we were talking about intelligence in adulthood, and we saw how traditional IQ testing fails to fully capture the nature of how humans use intelligence through the lifespan, especially through the lifespan. As we did cover, IQ testing is very useful, perhaps for um, measuring academic achievement or capacity for academic achievement, but it kind of stops there for the most part, though that doesn't mean that the idea of intelligence is not more broadly useful. So when shifting over to talking about crystallized and fluid intelligence or Sternberg's triarchic theory, especially the contextual intelligence, these are areas that help us understand how we use our intelligence in adulthood and even also how some of that changes as a function of the aging process. We saw that especially with the idea of crystallized intelligence, which relates to skill and expertise, are things that can increase over the lifespan, whereas fluid reasoning can decrease. Another way to think about lifespan effects is to look at Shy here. So this, we didn't get to Shy last time, so let's look at this. So Shy gives us 5 stages. The first stage, which is relevant for childhood and adolescence, is called the acquisitive stage. And this again is where we can simply just talk about academic achievement, right? We're using our intelligence for acquiring knowledge and the basic learning that we are exposed to in school. But then we move into our adulthood years. And so we are no longer worried so much about just academic performance, but we are trying to do things with our lives. We are maybe beginning a career. We are trying to establish ourselves in our career and understand what it is we're trying to do with our lives and ourselves, and make some sort of kind of progress along those lines. And so certainly all of that does in fact require solving problems. And it's worth pointing out that the kinds of problems that we face when trying to do all of those things are not the problems that we are taught how to solve in school, right? These are the kinds of ill-defined problems that I was getting at that require probably something like fluid intelligence quite a bit, right? And this pretty much also goes for the next stage, the responsible stage. So as we move a little bit further into our adulthood years, what we maybe could call early middle age, if there is such a thing, then we move into the responsible stage where I like to call this what people frequently call adulting, right? So this means that now you've established yourself in your career, but now maybe you have a family, so you have to do these other things, right? You have to figure out how to parent, of course. I think I mentioned that in the previous video, the challenges that come with figuring out how to do those things. You also have to try to buy a house, right? And that's a complex process that involves all these different things and documents you have to do and other things you have to take care of, like having a an inspection and an appraisal and a survey and all these other stuff, right? And it's just unnecessarily convoluted how much is involved. So it does, of course, take some degree of not just responsibility, but it takes some intelligence, right? And then a little bit further, and we get into the executive stage. So what are we talking about here? We'll call it late middle age. You know, do we put numbers on this? Not necessarily. There is a little side note, by the way. I learned this years ago when talking to an IO psychologist, industrial and organizational psychologist. These are the kinds of psychologists who work for companies and help them understand a lot about the maybe organizational culture and organizational structure, making sure that's all set up correctly. Also useful for helping to understand how different individual characteristics and personality traits and even intelligences, thinking like Gardner's multiple intelligence, uh, can be predictive of success in different kinds of jobs. We talked about the use of intelligence for job placement. That's something that IO psychologists would be interested in studying. But anyway, the point that I'm getting at here is that this person told me that it's quite common to see a lot of big companies, not necessarily these young startups where you have some entrepreneur who's in their 20s starting this company, but the bigger, more long established major corporations, when they are hiring a new CEO, it's very common for them to prefer to hire someone who's over the age of 50 or 55 even. And one claim that you could make here is that there are changes that happen with our mindset, with our intelligence, where we're now able to see kind of like these bigger picture problems, right? Bigger social problems, and we then develop the ability to understand those problems, but also that means that gives us insight and judgment into ways of solving those problems. And what comes with that also then is possibly a sense of kind of leadership. So the preference then is that the executives of these big companies tend to be in this executive stage of intelligence usage. And then as we shift over into late adulthood, the reintegrative stage means a realignment of our priorities. We no longer have to solve these big problems as in the executive stage. And our kids may be grown, so we don't have to worry about being responsible for them nearly as much. And our careers might be over. We may be retired from the career. So in this case, we don't have to worry about our own personal success. So now we can figure out what is it that we want to do with the rest of our lives, which is again another problem that needs to be solved, right? How do I adapt to the empty nest, retirement, and no longer having that career? And so that's something where I have to think about redefining myself and thinking about who I am and what do I want to get out of what remains of my lifespan. And then, of course, once I make those choices, comes the next step of doing those things. And so, again, this kind of reintegrative stage implies then that we reevaluate and realign our priorities here a little bit. But again, it requires some intelligence to do that effectively. So Shai is giving us a good illustration here. Even though this might be fairly culturally specific to a Western industrialized kind of lifespan, it certainly does at least capture how the use of intelligence can naturally change over the course of said lifespan. I would imagine, though, it could be useful to have equivalent stages for other cultural backgrounds as well here. But the point here is not to say that this is a universal theory of intelligence across the lifespan, but just a kind of a nice illustration of how it can change. Now, kind of embedded all throughout the stuff I've been talking about is this idea of expertise, right? Crystallized intelligence, acquiring skill. And one of the things that we really like to talk about here, especially for aging, is, as I noted at the beginning of the previous video, we've covered a lot of basic aging things, right? Like perceptual abilities can decline a little bit. Motor skills can decline a little bit, though we didn't necessarily talk a lot about motor skills, but we know that older adults do things a lot more physically slower. And cognitive skills, basic things like working memory, attention, and inhibition of distractors, those things, they all decline just a little bit, right? And so you might think, okay, put this all together, declines in perception, motor skill, reaction time, cognitive processing speed, and working memory and attention. And you could start to predict that maybe people decline in a lot of different uh, practical areas of functionality. This is where we talk about those activities of daily living and also especially those instrumental activities of daily living, the things that maybe require more cognition and executive function. But at the same time, we also have to realize that while older adults do have declines in many of these areas, they also have an accumulated number of years of experience in many of these areas, right? Think about driving as just one example. A lot of the things that I've just listed could predict that somebody's driving abilities may start to decline, and they may have some increased risk for having an accident. But at the same time, a person who's been driving for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years has accumulated a lot of practice and a lot of experience. So it is potentially possible, but let me emphasize the potential there, that they have become an expert driver. And this would suggest that it could be possible. We can imagine that expertise and skill can compensate for a decline in some of the basic abilities that we have seen here. Beyond that, it's also worth thinking about how older adults might know how to strategize as well. And by that, I mean that, it's one thing to say that my skill and my experience driving can compensate for my declines in reaction time. But another thing that older adults will frequently do is they will strategically choose when they drive. So it's one thing to go out driving around town during peak traffic hours, rush hour, and that sort of stuff, in which the demand is pretty high. Older adults might start to strategically decide to change their driving habits to avoid going out during those times of day. And when they need to drive, they will pick times of the day like early to mid afternoon or something where they might be able to predict that the traffic is less. They may drive less at night because of changes to their vision could impact their night vision a little bit, right? And we covered that. They might choose not to drive on days where the weather is bad, right? So if it's raining and there's low visibility and it's very cloudy, um, maybe just not drive on those days, right? So they wait for the more ideal conditions. So those are deliberate strategic choices that older adults make to also compensate. Let's get back to the expertise concept, though. So, does 50 years of driving make someone an expert? Uh, well, maybe, but maybe not, right? So, we have this, you may have heard of this 10,000 hour rule, right? And so, where does this come from? I'm noting right off the bat that this is a myth. It comes from the fact that some researchers at Florida State, Anders Ericsson and some others, did some research on expertise in musical performance. I believe it was sometimes musical expertise is studied on people who are professional, like symphony orchestra musicians, sometimes on Olympic quality athletes. And they noted, of course, that one thing that these people had in common is they did have many thousands of hours of practice on their specialty, right? And so 10,000 hours at least in many of these cases. But then the author Malcolm Gladwell came up with this, noted that number and kind of started to popularize it when Erickson and the rest of the Florida State people were not really pushing this as a hard and fast rule. So we say that the 10,000 hour practice rule is a myth, but, and what do I mean here? Time and practice are still not essential, right? So what I would say here is that 50 years of driving might entail 10,000 hours worth of being behind the wheel. That by itself doesn't make you an expert. What makes you an expert is what we're going to call deliberate practice. And of course, deliberate practice does take a long, long time. So you do need the time, but you also need to have these four characteristics of deliberate practice as well. Structured, goal-directed practice. What do we mean by structured and goal-directed? Well, meaning that when I begin a practice session, like if I'm practicing to be a musician and to improve my musical ability, what I need to do is I need to start that practice with a goal in mind, right? That there's something that at the beginning of this practice, I am not yet able to do, but I have a clearly defined goal that through the practice, I'm working towards that specific milestone. That would, of course, give structure to my practice because what I'm working on is not just repetition of things that I already know how to do, but it's about improving my progress towards that goal. And so it's engaging in exercises that are designed to help me get to that particular goal that I'm working for. It's also useful here to have a mentor, a coach, a teacher of some sort, because a good mentor knows what your goals ought to be, right? This is one thing that's very, very difficult when it comes to what we might call teaching yourself anything, right? Whether it's teaching yourself in school or in musical skills or athletic skill or whatever it is. I sometimes don't know what I don't know, right? And that means that I don't know the things that I don't know anything about the skills I don't yet have. So having someone who's prepared to set those goals for me to say that, okay, now that you've mastered this, this is the next thing you really should try next. I wouldn't necessarily know that. So having a good expert mentor is very, very useful. And of course, the other thing that a good coach and mentor does is gives you feedback, right? They let you know when you have successfully achieved those goals, when you have mastered whatever the skill is, or when you still need to keep working and exactly what you need to do to keep going to get there, right? And so the repetition is there, but it's repetition with refinement, right? You are in fact getting better, and you know you're getting better because you have good feedback and you have goals, right? All of these things are characteristics of deliberate practice. So just mere repetition, mere driving for 50 years doesn't necessarily make you better and to the extent that deliberate practice would make you better, right? But driving aside, this means then that there are perhaps things that people can become expert in if they do have all of these, aspects of deliberate practice associated with what they're doing. And then, of course, as a reminder, it would still take a lot of time. So, yeah, how many years does 10,000 hours make? Well, it depends, of course, on how you distribute that, but nevertheless, it's going to take a while to get there. A little note here before we move forward to say more about expertise, we also have another psychological theory of skill acquisition. It's been around for, I don't know, 50 years, I think, from Fitz and Posner. And so the idea here is that as we are learning skills, one of the first things that happen is that when we first start doing it, it's a very slow and very effortful, demanding kind of thing, and we make a lot of mistakes. This is called the cognitive stage because it is very just purely you're in your head a lot, right? You're just trying to figure things out, and you spend a lot of time having to think about what you're doing, right? Then we move into the associative stage where you start to make more connections. That's why it's called the associative stage. You're associating ideas together. So you make connections and you see patterns that you didn't notice before, and that reduces your memory load, your working memory load. It makes so you're making fewer mistakes and you're getting a little faster and a little bit better. So we're transitioning here to higher levels of performance. And then finally, we get into the autonomous stage. This is when we really have understood what those patterns are that are important for higher levels of performance. So it becomes much less cognitive, much less in your head. You're able to just sort of turn your brain off and it becomes more automatic in nature. There's an interesting state that sometimes occurs associated with high levels of performance called a flow state, right? And in a flow state, a person just sort of gets into this very automatic, mindless, but super high level of performance where everything appears to just come naturally. And they report even afterwards that when they were in that state, everything was just happening very, very naturally without very much effort. And so it felt very easy to them, even though, of course, what they were doing is associated with a very high level of difficulty. We see this a lot in sports performances. So, again, the idea is that as we think about older adults having declines in working memory, for example, again, for something that they have already, achieved expertise in, and they are in that autonomous stage, engaging in that activity is not something that necessarily has a large working memory demand associated with it. So they could still, in theory, be able to engage in high level expert performance on certain tasks, not on everything, but only on the things in which they have achieved expertise in. So this is the idea here, is that expertise is something that older adults can have if they've trained appropriately. Certainly more likely to see it in older adults than younger adults because of the time it takes. It's also something that we can keep, right? So as long as we keep doing it and we keep practicing and we keep having the structured goal-directed performance and practice and all of that, then it's kind of like crystallized intelligence. We can just keep accumulating and keep getting better, right? But importantly, as I was getting at here, it is domain specific, right? So this is not like some broad cognitive ability that, like IQ in general, that just gives us broad problem solving skills, right? This is something that happens within a very specific domain. As I just noted, experts then show less mental effort when they are engaged in tasks related to their expertise. So not necessarily in all situations, right? But only in situations where their expertise is relevant. And that means then that they're going to have less demand on their attention and memory systems during these kinds of tasks. And there's another kind of compensation that we can talk about. We see that experts see patterns that novices don't. And that's a big part of the reduced working memory demand here because, contrast that with this little point at the bottom about novices seeing bits and pieces of information, right? So in any complex task, you might have a lot of information that you have to use to make a decision. And if you are a novice where you're just getting all of that information, then each individual piece of information is just one thing that you have to kind of think about and you have to remember it and you have to figure out how it relates to all the other bits and pieces of information. This is where the decision making starts to become difficult because you're trying to track this information. It's loading your working memory with all of this stuff. Some of it might even be irrelevant, so you're really having to sort through all of that. It really makes the performance very difficult. But if you are an expert who can see the patterns, what I'm really suggesting here is this is something, there's a technical term for this called dimension reduction. And what you're doing is you've got a lot of dimensions of information coming in, but you're able to reduce that down to recognize a pattern, right? That you're seeing a trend in all of these different pieces of information so that you start to say, this is the situation that I am in. And now that I can recognize the pattern and I know the situation, I know how to deal with this situation. I know what the solution is, right? I like talking about this in the case of these pictures on the right-hand side of the screen here. This is the pilot, Chesley Sullenberger, who famously had to land his Airbus uh, jet fully loaded with passengers and fuel and everything into the Hudson River in New York several years ago. Sullenberger was I believe, just shy of his 58th birthday on when this event occurred. And at the time, or just prior to this at least anyway, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, had a mandatory age 60 retirement rule for commercial aviation. Commercial aviation meaning pilots for airliners like this, right? And why did they have a mandatory age 60 retirement rule? Well, because of so many of the things we've talked about in this class and what we know about declines in certain abilities with age. And this caused a concern over liability, that they didn't want to have somebody have an aviation related accident that it could be attributed to some kind of decline in their piloting skill. But let's think, though, about what's going on. Why am I talking about Sullenberger here with expertise? Because what we know about Sullenberger's history as a pilot is that he had a ton of experience flying this particular this craft, the Airbus. He also had a ton of simulator experience as well, because that's part of maintaining your skills as a pilot, is that a lot of things that you need to be prepared to handle don't occur during the daily course of piloting. So if you spend some time in the simulator, that allows you to, of course, you can program into the simulator specific failures of things, right? And you can practice what that feels like when there's a certain failure happening in your aircraft. You can practice what it looks like, not just in terms of through the windows, but what it looks like on the display, right? All of these displays are telling you different things here. You've got a whole array of pieces of information there, but you practice it so you get to notice, hey, this particular set of visual information from my displays, the feel of the plane, all of it, that begins to become a pattern and you know what to do. So what happened with this flight, right? So they took off from the airport in New York. I think that was LaGuardia. They had multiple bird strikes, meaning that they ran into birds as they were ascending, and that damages their engine, so they lose engine power. So now they're gliding, and he's got a these are big planes, by the way, right? These are some of the biggest airliners that exist. We got a big plane, fully loaded with fuel, just took off, fully loaded with passengers. And he immediately reports to air traffic control, bird strike, loss of this engine, and then second bird strike, loss of this other engine. So now they're in a pretty critical situation. And air traffic control, or ATC, they are immediately clearing runways because they're calling out to him, okay, this runway is clear. And so he has to make the call. Can I make the turn, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the plane without engine power, but you can still turn the rudders and flaps so you can steer this plane and return to that particular runway. What you have to realize is that as soon as you do something like that, you're losing your forward momentum, and the plane will actually start to lose altitude as you do this. So this means that we have to be able to make a prediction given our current airspeed and our current altitude. What would happen if I made this bank to return to a specific runway? Would I still have enough altitude and airspeed to make it there, or would I end up crashing into the city? Um, and so he starts rejecting the offers from ATC. He's like, no, I can't make that one. I can't make that one. And they start giving him another runway, I think, up in New Jersey. And and again, he's just making this call, and not very much time goes by before he makes the call. We're going to be in the river, right? So he's already understood. He already knows where these runways are, right? He's been through this route many times, so he knows his plane. He knows where the airports are, where the runways are, and while ATC are calling out his options, he's already working through his options, and he's made the call. There's only one choice. We're going to have to land this thing in the water, right? And so, of course, we don't have a computer on board that can run these simulations and perform these calculations for us, right? We have to rely on the pilot to make the correct call. And then once he makes the correct call, has to then execute what would be a supremely difficult maneuver, which is to land a very large, very heavy uh, jumbo jet into the Hudson River. And as you can see in the picture, he successfully did that. No casualties, right? Everyone safe and sound. So the question that I always ask coming into this kind of situation here is, if you were a passenger on this plane, who do you want piloting this plane? Do you want a 58 or 59 or even 60 or 61-year-old Sullenberger who has some of these age-related declines, but also has all of the expertise that I've just defined? Or do you want that younger, sharper, faster, stronger pilot who has this basic skills, but just not have necessarily the time and the structured practice and the high level of expertise to recognize the patterns, right? Could such a younger pilot have been overconfident and thought maybe they could actually return this plane to a runway? After the incident was over, there were lots of computer simulations performed to determine whether or not he made the right call. And it turns out he did. If he had actually attempted to make those return flights to other runways, he would not have made it. So he did the right thing here. And so this is a good, kind of I think a good take-home lesson that, age is about declines, but it's also about other things in which we are gaining here, right? And so he has gained the expertise and good judgment. And this is our last topic then, which is once we have this expertise and good judgment and so forth, we can talk about this other theme that we talk about with aging called wisdom. What does it mean to be a wise person? And is this something that we associate with age? Well, we do kind of maybe unofficially associate it with age, but is it something that necessarily is only a part of age, right? So by that I mean, is it possible for a young adult to be wise as well? And I think the answer is potentially yes. But that's also where we sometimes get the phrase of describing someone as an old soul, perhaps, because maybe they show these characteristics that we associate with older people, but they show it at a younger age. But is it also true that all older people are wise? And I think the answer there is not necessarily, right? But we need to ask a hard question, of course, which is what do we even mean by the term wisdom in the first place? And so is it just accumulated intelligence, like crystallized intelligence? Is it having good judgment? But what does that mean? One issue about judgment are some things that I have talked about before. I'm just looking ahead. Yeah, so these judgment bias issues here. The issue of a judgment bias comes up in cognitive psychology, that sometimes people exhibit biases like a confirmation bias or the availability bias and representativeness bias and things like that. And it might be the case that what a person that we call wise is good at avoiding those sort of pitfalls of human reasoning, right? That they recognize when they might be prone to a specific kind of bias, and then they're able to avoid letting that bias affect their judgment. So there's at least room to include that here, but it's not going to give us the whole bigger picture. So let's look at what we might think of as the bigger picture here. So our standard definition of intelligence I have here expert knowledge about the fundamental problems in life. So I don't even know if that's answering the question, right? But I kind of hinted at this throughout this video and the previous one, which is we are faced with problems in life that are sometimes pretty complicated, right? We have relationship problems and work problems and various other moral dilemmas that we may have to face. And again, we don't learn in school how to solve these problems. These are classic ill-defined problems with no clear-cut path towards a solution in most cases, and oftentimes not even immediate feedback about whether we have made the right or wrong choice once we select a choice. This suggests then that these kinds of problems are inherently ambiguous, right? And having a tolerance for ambiguity is pretty critical here. There's a lot of times in life where we want to find logical answers to problems. And the claim is that if there is a logical answer to a problem, then that means there's a black and white good or bad answer, right? That if I can reason my way through this and be very, very rational, that would lead me to believe that I have found an objectively true, good answer to my problem. But in reality, not every problem has such a clear cut right or wrong answer or logical approach to it, right? There are shades of gray. There's nuance, right? And that happens a lot in life. And for people who want to insist on always having some logical black and white answer to things, they're not necessarily going to thrive in these situations where ambiguity becomes the kind of ruling factor here. So being able to thrive in complex and ambiguous situations, to tolerate that ambiguity and not try to simplify it down into simple black and white answers, that's going to be something we might better characterize as a form of wisdom. Related to the good judgment issue is emotional regulation, because again, I hesitate to appeal to logic, but sometimes when people debate over appropriate ways to solve problems, um, the people who are very logical oftentimes look down on people who are overly emotional because they think that the emotion is clouding your judgment, right? And certainly that can be true, but it's also worth pointing out that in many cases, emotions are quite relevant to solving problems, because this is especially true, I think, in moral decision making, where I might have to make a decision about some kind of situation where, depending on the outcome of my decision, somebody might be harmed. Imagine, for example, a doctor who has to make a choice between two different kinds of approaches to treating a patient. And in one case, there's a certain risk for harm, and in another case, there's another risk for harm, and the risk might be lower, but the harm might be worse. And so we have to make an appropriate judgment call here. And if I let the my fear over that harm overwhelm me, it might influence my ability to make a good judgment call here. But at the same time, I need to have some level of emotion associated with this. I can't just be cold and calculated all the time. Being able to anticipate the negative emotional reactions of doing the wrong thing turns out to be quite useful sometimes in helping us avoid doing the wrong thing. So here we need to talk about balance, I think, is the issue, right? And that's what I mean by emotional regulation here. It's not about shutting your emotions off entirely, but it's about finding the right balance between being overly emotional and completely unemotional, right? Perspective taking is useful here because, it relates to this issue of ambiguity, that my view on a particular dilemma that we're facing in a relationship might be different than another person's, or the other person in the relationship's perspective, right? So being able to understand that just my view of things is not the only way of viewing it. And that means I'm going to have to take in other people's perspectives, and this creates additional nuance to the problem. Sometimes if we're not ready to tolerate that nuance, then again, we're going to be less willing to adopt other people's perspectives, and that's going to make us less good at solving these difficult problems. Another issue here is metacognition. This is kind of what I said earlier about kind of knowing when you're about to be prone to one of these classic judgment biases. But metacognition means just awareness of your own abilities at the cognitive level, right? If I know, for example, this is kind of like what I was doing talking about with the driving stuff, right? That if an older adult knows that they can't handle driving in rush hour anymore, or if they can't see so well at night anymore, then they're going to, if they're aware of that, right? Then they're going to be able to make better decisions about selectively choosing when they drive and under what circumstances they drive. Um, and so that's behavior, strategic behavior that's regulated by their metacognition, right? Their awareness of their own abilities and limitations. So having good metacognition means then that we can appropriately recognize when those limits might interfere with some of our abilities. So it could be a form of wisdom as well. There's even research on wisdom. So this comes here, we got the Berlin wisdom paradigm. And so again, a lot of this stuff might be slightly redundant with everything that I've just listed here, but we got all this rich knowledge, right? Life knowledge, life experience, years of experience to draw from here. Also, procedural knowledge about solving problems. So this means here that, if we faced, related to these years of experience, if we faced problems in the past, maybe not this exact problem, but something similar, we'll probably have some advice and ideas about how to proceed first, right? And then we'll see what happens. Um, Here with lifespan contextualism, one of the things that we also start to be aware of, when you're younger, you certainly have an awareness of your past, but it's harder to think maybe about the future a little bit because there's so much stuff into the future that it's hard to see. Um, but with the accumulation of more life experience, then maybe being able to understand the past, present, and future is something that comes into a little bit more clarity here. Tolerance for differing perspectives, like I just said, means also understanding that people may have different values, different priorities about what they want out of their lives, and their moral beliefs can be different as well. So being able to accept and understand those kinds of individual differences and not try to impose your values on others when trying to solve problems, certainly I think is a pretty critical ability here. And, once again, so I won't belabor the point, tolerance of uncertainty, but also being able to manage and function under uncertainty. It's one thing to not be upset by it, and that's the tolerance, but also to actually function well with uncertainty. Um, these are all characteristics here of what we associate with the concept of wisdom. And just as a note here at the bottom, it's these kinds of skills that I think equips you to handle those infamous ill-defined problems that I've been talking about, and certainly seems to overlap a little with contextual intelligence as we've defined it. So I was asking the question earlier, is wisdom something we can associate with being able to avoid the famous or infamous reasoning biases like the confirmation bias, the representativeness bias, the availability bias, the anchoring bias? What I have a note here is that wisdom can maybe make us less prone to some of these. Which ones exactly? Possibly the confirmation bias, right? So the idea is that I'm aware of my beliefs and I have better metacognition, so I might be somewhat more aware of when I'm letting my own beliefs influence my judgment here a little bit. So we might be able to avoid some of them, but there's a paradox here. So again, this is where the metacognitive issues become relevant here. So it's called Solomon's paradox, and the idea is that sometimes if I'm trying to solve somebody else's problems, it's a little bit easier for me to notice when somebody is falling prone to a bias and they're being biased, and that's affecting their judgment in a situation, and I can analyze that and give them some good advice. But when it comes to my own problems, sometimes I still fail to be aware of where my own limitations are and uh, have good metacognition in terms of my own biases and my own limitations and shortcomings and so forth. So I can be a whole lot better at helping other people than I can about helping myself, right? So wisdom is not necessarily always an all or none kind of thing, right? Sometimes people are good about giving advice to others and not so good about following it themselves. And so that's just a paradox that we recognize here, right? Last up is a different way to think about wisdom. And we give it a funny name because that's what we do in psychology. We have to give everything a special name. But but where this comes from is from Piaget. So I'm assuming you've had the developmental psychology lifespan course in which you've covered Piaget's stages of cognitive development in childhood primarily, right? So we start in infancy with the sensory motor stage, and then we go into pre-operational thinking, and then into concrete operational thinking, and then into formal operational thinking. And what's advancing through these stages and what Piaget really emphasized is reasoning skills. So infants don't have reasoning skills at all, right? They're just pure about learning how to operate the world around them and learning the basic rules of reality. In pre-operational thinking, it's called that because children lack reasoning skills, but they are at least a little more symbolic with their thinking. They fall prone to things like the conservation error, right? And then in concrete operational thinking in childhood, we get some basic reasoning skills. But finally, in formal operational reasoning in adolescence, this is when we master abstract thinking and deductive logic. And as far as Piaget is concerned, that is the culmination of human cognition, is to master deductive logic. But of course, it misses a lot of the stuff that we have been talking about so far, including, of course, the wisdom and the idea that not every problem has a logical solution, right? So again, what happens when logic fails us, right? That simple logic is not necessarily always going to give us an answer to a very complex, ill-defined, real-world problem that requires nuance and tolerance for uncertainty. And this is where the authors of this research here, going back to the 1980s, refer to it as post-formal thinking, right? So a fifth stage now beyond formal operational thinking, coming after that, we'll call it post-formal thinking. And so again, the idea is that it involves this kind of contextual thinking, right? That there's sometimes the right answer might very much depend on a situational factor here, right? That there's not necessarily universal right and wrong. This is always the right way to solve a problem kind of a thing, right? Sometimes the answer is very context specific. Dialectical thinking means being able to accept contradictions, this kind of back and forth of opposing viewpoints and understanding the two viewpoints and finding a balance between them. Pragmatism means finding practical solutions, compromising certain perspectives so that you can find a balance there. And once again, metacognition, right? Understanding. So when we talk about metacognition, we talk about awareness of our own biases and our limitations, right? But sometimes we're not always accurate. Sometimes people are overconfident. They overestimate their abilities. Sometimes people are underconfident. So when we talk about calibration, we talk about managing to find some good match here between what my actual confidence levels are and my actual ability levels. And as long as those align to each other, we would say we have accurate metacognition or well-calibrated metacognition. So that's another feature here. How this research works frequently is that they present people with what are called life dilemmas, right? So they have a fictional set of characters who are involved in a life dilemma. And they present these dilemmas to, say, adolescents who are not yet in post-formal thinking, but maybe they're in formal operational thinking. And what you find is that adolescents give answers that focus on simple, rigid, logical answers, right? That this has got to be the right way to do it. So they take a more universal kind of, view of things like this. There's one way to solve this problem. It's logical, clear cut, black and white. They might be right, they might be wrong. But what we see is that for people who would be categorized as post-formal thinkers, when they're presented with these kinds of life dilemmas, they start saying very different things, right? They start things like, what's the situation that we're in? Maybe I need more information, right? You've given me a little blurb, a little explanation of this dilemma that these people are involved in, but I need more information. There's nuance, there's context that's missing from the story you're telling me. So, I can't give you a good solid answer unless we explore this a little bit. Um, and then they sometimes also give answers where they say that, there's no clear-cut right or wrong answer to this question, but, it could work this way, or maybe it's another way. So they don't commit to hard and fast answers here, right? So they're trying to be pragmatic. Sometimes they even admit when they don't know enough, right? So again, there's the metacognition. We're like, I don't know enough about these people that you're telling me about to give you a good solid answer. So one more time, it's very contextual, it's very situational, it's very dialectic, and it reflects some awareness of their own metacognitive limits as well. All right. Well, I think yes, that is this done. We're done for that particular chapter. So all good for this. As always, of course, let me know if you ever have any questions about this material, and we will pick it up again with the next chapter very soon. So I'm just trying to control my mouse here. There we go.